I was in the first segregated class until 1933. Throughout 33, that was the first year of the Nazis.
When you say segregated class?
Jews separate from everybody else. We were the first grade, first and second grade were segregated in a school that had others. And the next year, by the time I was in second grade, they gave a whole school to only Jewish children, from K through 12. My parents were very careful to shield us from things. But you couldn't help it. For instance, I saw a wonderful portrait in your gallery of Mr. Streicher, who was the publisher of the Stürmer. And you know, that was Goebbels' most brilliant stroke, the whole idea of propaganda. You say something over and over and over again, and even though people don't believe it at first, by the third year, they're saying, you know, they can't invent those stories every week. And there must be some truth to it. And all of a sudden, they begin to believe it. And we saw this happen in our neighbors. You know, especially my grandfather, who gave up, he was in the army in the First World War, and he came back and gave up his business and had it in his home and traveled every day to a little town, and everybody bought from him. By 37, people were saying, Mr. Rothschild, don't come to our home anymore. We'll come to you and buy. By 38, business was getting worse and worse, and pretty soon nobody came because they're believing these things, you know. And you shouldn't buy from him. He's going to cheat you, and he's going to do this. My grandfather was the most honest man in the world, and it actually, he did get to this country finally, but he was never the same, you know, because he just couldn't believe it. You know, I mean, that this could happen to him. He had 10 brothers in the army, all had the Iron Cross. Big deal, well, you know, big help it was to them. And my father was very close to Buber, Martin Buber, and he wrote him a letter in 1936, and he said, I think we should stick it out here because I think we have to prove to them that what they say is false. He still believed that he could beat them. By 37, he changed his mind, and in 38, of course, it just turned around at Kristallnacht. And here's what happened Kristallnacht. On the 9th of November, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the 9th to the 10th, we heard a big explosion. We lived outside the center of the city, and we heard this explosion, which was the chapel of the Jewish cemetery. They exploded that. That was the first sound we heard. And since he was the chief cantor, he didn't do morning services, usually on weekdays. On Sabbath, yes, but not on weekdays, except on what, you know, the Jews celebrate the first of the month as a sort of a holiday. And it was the first of the Jewish month, and so he had to do services at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he always rode his bicycle into the town, and he saw it was in flames. I mean, and he escaped. Just somebody recognized him and said, "You got to grab him." He escaped. There were thousands of people there, so he escaped, came home, and said to my mother, "You've got to get our passports." We were supposed to get our passports to go to America that day, on the 10th of November. So they said, "Listen, you've got to go to the passport office." Well, she went, and she took. She knew that it was going to cost, you know, because there was a man at the passport office who would say, "No passports for Jews today, 3,500 marks." So you slipped him the money, he gave you the passport. So he said, "But for your husband, 10,000 marks. He has to come himself." Well, she said, "But he can't. I mean, they're going to arrest him." He said, "I don't care what. So he had to go. We didn't have that much money, but my grandfather did. He lent him money. He got the passport. So he said, I'm going to go to Holland with the passport. Well, it was very silly because they caught him at the border. There was a J in the passport. So they caught him at the border, and he was put in Sachsenhausen, which was a concentration camp near the border. Well, it was, as I said, it was silly to go because we had a neighbor, a new neighbor. It used to be a Jewish couple was on the next in the next apartment, but they moved to New York, and the head of the SS of Mannheim moved next door. Well, we were scared to death. I mean, this was. However, he was a very strict Catholic who said, I will not take part in this business, and in my house, nothing is going to happen. So 2 SS stood in front of our house. Nothing happened in our apartment. Our crystal was not touched, nothing. If my father had stayed home, he would never have been taken to a concentration camp.
Right.
But he left.
Right.
They got him. 3 days later, President Roosevelt pulled back the American ambassador from Berlin and said, we will not deal with barbarians who treat their people this way. So the Nazis, in order to make a gesture of goodwill, let the 50,000 Jews that they had taken into custody on Kristallnacht, let them go, including my father. My father came home, and we were lucky. You see, my father was born in Belgium, and when he was 1 year old, they moved back to Hamburg. But during my father's father was a guest there, and then he came back, and we were on the Belgian quota. And you know, according to Americans, where you're born, that's your citizenship. And that was our luck,
Right.
because nobody wanted to come from Belgium. The German quota was filled. The Belgian quota, we were 35, 36, 37, 38, my sister and I, and my parents. So we went to the American consulate. We thought that was the end of the story, but it wasn't. There were real anti-Semites in the Foreign Service, you know. In those days, and I understand also today, but I don't know about that. But in those days, they would do any chicanery that they could. Well, we went from Mannheim to Stuttgart. The American consulate was in Stuttgart. And in those days, they ran trains. Coal was, you know, and a little splinter got into my mother's eye. And she rubbed it. We got there, and her eye was very red. The American doctor looked at it and said, Mrs. Adler, you have a very serious eye disease. You can't, your family and you can't go to America. They had let my father go, and they told him, in 10 days, you're out of here or you can't ever go. Because with clergy, they acted that way. Well, this was already 2 days, you know, into that period. And we got back, and my mother went to a specialist, and he said, Mrs. Adler, you have nothing, it's, you know, you rubbed your eye. So 2 days later, she went back with an affidavit from this ophthalmologist, and the doctor said, I don't believe that. I know that you have a very serious eye disease. So she said, but my husband, he said, okay, I'll tell you something. Your husband can go. I'll give you a visa for him, but you and the children have to stay. So, of course, my father had to go, so he went to Holland to wait for us. And he said, come back in a month and I'll examine you again. Well, it took another month then for us to get the visa and to come. But before then, I want to tell you an interesting story. When my father came back from Sachsenhausen, he, as I told you before, hated this music that was done in the synagogue for hundreds of years. There was always a big choir of 100 people, a big organ. And when they destroyed this central synagogue, it was right in the center of a block of apartments. They couldn't put a firebomb or something in it, but they put an explosive charge into the ark and blew that out. And under the organ, and so the organ was hanging over the gallery by one cable. So my father said to my mother, "We've got to rescue the music of the Mannheim synagogue." So she said, "You're crazy. I mean, there's SS in the, and I'm going to take Sam, and we're going to go up to the choir loft." Well, my father always got his way, so he knew a way underneath the street. We went upstairs to the choir loft. You've never seen such disaster. I mean, there was a big hole where the organ was, hanging down. Well, we did get, there were 17 part books, which he wanted to get, and we did get them, and they were in, all over the place. And we were going to go down, and there was so much dust, I sneezed. The captain downstairs said, "Go upstairs, shoot at sight." At that moment, the organ fell down. So I'm here.
And we're glad. Wow.